Come on, Judith. Come on, Judith, sit down. Good. We can get going. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody, to the final evening of our season of, I was going to say lectures, talks, conversations. They certainly develop into conversations by the time we finish, don't they? And it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Bishop Paul Bayes, who is sitting at the front here and waving at you. I first met Paul not that long ago on the General Synod of the Church of England. We were sentenced there for some heinous crime, and I can't remember what it was, but we were both there. And I always remember Paul as someone who, when he approached the rostrum or the lectern or whatever it was, people sat up and waited to be interested. And then several months ago, I was leafing through the Church Times, and there's a little section in the Church Times that has quotes of the week. And there were two quotes of the week from Bishop Paul Bayes, and they were both incendiary. They were Christian in a very sort of forceful way. And I thought, interesting, right. And then in the committee of this august body, we were looking for speakers, and I suggested Paul. And Judith, of course, said, right, go for it. So I did, and here we are. Paul has been Bishop of Hertford and Bishop of Liverpool. Now, that's a challenge in anybody's book, and particularly following Bishop James Jones, who did an absolutely extraordinary piece of ministry, particularly with the Hillsborough inquiry, you will remember. Paul has been retired, is it 14 months, Paul? Yeah, 14 months. And he's living in Bath, and he's very kindly agreed to talk to us about the poor. We were sitting in the committee, and that enigmatic phrase of Jesus is, you'll always have the poor with you. I wondered what that meant. So we hope that Paul will take that as a starter, but also develop the question of dependence, because poverty is now very different from what it was 2,000 years ago. And it's a challenge which the church faces. So Paul, over to you. We'll break at about 8:15 and then start conversations. So build up your questions as we go. Paul.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. That's great. I was just saying to our friend who runs the AV system, when I was a working bishop 4 times in my ministry, people rushed up to me after church and said, Bishop, would you please turn your microphone off? But I didn't have one on at the time. I've got my first degree was in drama and theatre arts, and I learned there how to project my voice. So if you poor friends at the front are getting blown away by the volume, just let me know and I'll tone it down. It's very good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. I've been retired for a while now, and I've got a few things to do. But this was a great opportunity, partly because I remember and greatly respect David, who just introduced me, partly because the subject you offered me is one that I'm not normally offered, which is really good, and partly because it's just nice to keep your hand in. Not so much with the talking as with the listening. And I'm looking forward to receiving wisdom from you when we have our conversation time in a little while. I'm just glancing at the clock to see that the clock tells me it's 3:10 in the afternoon. So if I keep looking at my watch, please don't think it's because I can't wait to get out of here. Something about my own journey I'll share in a moment, and then I'm going to share some compasses for how you think about poverty from popular sociology. No, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not a social scientist. Some of you here may have experience in those areas, and if you do, then we'll be greatly enriched later. But there are 2 or 3 works of popular sociology which have influenced me and certainly influenced what we did in Liverpool. And then I want to talk briefly about asset-based community development, ABCD, asset-based community development, which is a way of working. Some of you, again, may be long skilled in it. But the reason I wanted to talk about ABCD is that that's how we tried to work in Liverpool, and because it directly impacts this word dependence, which David gave me to talk about. The poor you have always with you, poverty and dependence. It's an interesting perspective, a very accurate one. So I'll talk about ABCD. And then I'm going to talk about Liverpool and about the Liverpool era. I stand on the shoulders of giants as an ex-bishop of Liverpool. The work of Bishop James Jones was just referred to. And James is revered in the city because of what he did for the Hillsborough families. But the more significant piece of shaping of the church in Liverpool was done before James came by his predecessor, Bishop David Shepherd. And I'm going to talk about Bishop David's book, By Us to the Poor, and about Faith in the City, which was the report that Bishop David was the vice chair of the group that produced it. And then just to contrast the Shepherd years and the approach of the church in those years with the present day or the most recent past and my own approach. My own successor in Liverpool is now in post. And I've always said I'm going to be remembered as that tall guy. There was some tall guy there between Bishop James and Bishop John. And that's my high expectation. But John Perumbalath is my successor. And if you have a moment to pray for Liverpool, pray for John, who's really got started really well. I'm a working class boy. I was born in Bradford in Yorkshire, in an area very close to the Asian community there, the heart of the Asian community. My dad was a works manager and my mum was a home help supervisor. She used to come home. She was responsible for a big estate, the Homewood estate in Bradford, and she used to come home, having been around the houses to check out what the home helps were doing. She would stand in the bath, take off all her clothes and shake them out so as to get the lice out into the bath before she changed and got ready to give us our tea. That was the work that she did. She was a church woman, as was my father. I was brought up as a Christian by people who were involved at that level in the life of the North and of Yorkshire in particular. I had a state school education. I was the first generation from my family to go to university. I got a degree in drama, as I said a minute ago, and then I had a year off, which was unemployed, but which I was working voluntarily for a detached youth project in central Birmingham, St Basil's Centre, fantastic outfit. And then I got a postgraduate qualification in theology and got ordained. And in my ordained life, I worked in the northeast, in Whitley Bay, and then I worked in London, in the university there, and then I worked in High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, and then in Totton in Hampshire. And then I was a staff policy advisor for mission and evangelism for the Archbishop's Council. That's where I met Jean, who's sitting here at the back, and keeping me honest, so that if I say anything which in Jean's own word would count as bullshit, then she will tell me, because it's really important that we should keep ourselves honest in the church. And after that, they asked me to be a bishop. And I was the suffragan bishop of Hertford in the Diocese of St Albans, and then the Bishop of Liverpool from 2014 to 2022. I tell you that history because in a sense you think, oh, he was the Bishop of Liverpool, he must know about poverty because he comes from Liverpool. But in High Wycombe was a town, it's a town, 78,000 people. If you go 15 miles in any direction, you're in the stockbroker belt. Gerrard's Cross, places like that. 15 miles at Marlow, 15 miles in any direction. But Wycombe itself is a working class town full of bodgers. That is to say, people whose work is done with their hands in the furniture industry. 10% of High Wycombe is previous residents of St Vincent, Vincentians. There are more Vincentians in Wycombe than anywhere in the world except St Vincent. 10% of Wycombe are Mirpuri Kashmiri people, Muslim people. There are more people from Mirpur in High Wycombe than anywhere in England except for Bradford, where I was born. In 1981, there were riots in Toxteth, Liverpool, riots in Brixton, and there was a riot in High Wycombe. What I'm trying to say is that you can find poverty, if you look for it, just about anywhere. When I was Bishop of Hertford, I was responsible for Hertfordshire and for Barnet. The inequality across that area is substantial. You can be in Chorleywood, or you could be in Watford. You can be in Luton, which I used to describe as, well, I used to go to Harpenden, the richest town in England, and I used to say to the people of Harpenden, what's it like living in South Luton? Boy, they hated that. But actually, it's just a little bit up the road from Harpenden, Luton. In other words, wherever you look, you'll find inequality. Mike Walling, who used to be the minister in this church, sent me a paper. He can't be here tonight, apparently, but he sent me a paper, in case I was interested, called Poverty in Canterbury Today, by Jan Paul and Martin Weiss. Some of you here may know that. Some of you may have written it or certainly read it. It speaks about, well, I'm quoting it now, although the Canterbury district appears to be a relatively affluent place, it was recognized many households and individuals live in poverty. Official UK government definition, households are considered to be in poverty if their income is 60% below the median household income for that region. We were having supper a moment ago with Richard and Jennifer Llewellyn, who kindly are looking after me tonight. And we were saying that kind of statistic, really interesting as it is not worth a candle compared with the story of people who talk about what they can and can't do. And you know people, if you are involved in your local church at all, you know people whose lives are touched by poverty. And I'm going to talk now about that, having tried to introduce myself. The poor, David quoted, you have with you always. Now that's a deniable proposition, depending on your understanding of poverty. Some people look to poverty as an absolute. If you're absolutely poor, then you're destitute, you don't have a thing to eat, you don't have a home, you don't have anything to give you health care, and we see that kind of poverty in the world, most in the global south. But there's also a way of looking at poverty as relative. If poverty is relative, then you're going to always have it with you, because there's always going to be someone who counts as poor relative to whoever counts as rich. In the Canterbury paper that Mike showed me, there's a community organizer in this city, and again, you may be here, who was quoted there as saying, poverty is both absolute and relative. It's not having enough money, and also not having the money to have the sort of life that others can afford. It is, being poor is, to be excluded from the mainstream of society. The result is that poverty is associated with struggle in the present and fear for the future. That definition of poverty that community organizer used is one that was first crystallized by Peter Townsend in the 1960s, and also in a book that he wrote in 1975. But if you focus on absolute poverty, then you can be led to the position that many people on the right of the political spectrum are led to, namely to say there is no poverty in the developed world, there is no poverty, there are occasional pieces of mismanagement on the part of people. So, to quote the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, you can get by on 30 pence a day if you know how to spend it. So if you don't get by on your 30 pence a day, it must be because you don't know how to spend it. So if you're feckless enough not to get by on your 30 pence a day, you go to a food bank. But according to Lee Anderson, nobody needs to go to a food bank. And according to Jacob Rees-Mogg, Sir Jacob, as we must learn to call him, according to Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, food banks are a marvelous expression of the charitable heart of the nation, because nobody needs them, because there is no absolute poverty. If you believe that, then you will be disappointed by the things that I have to say. In 2010, I became the Bishop of Hertford. In that year, I was invited by the High Sheriff of Hertfordshire to a dinner party, and the way that they did it there was that in the dinner party, people stood up, 2 or 3 people, were asked if they'd just say a few words, just to help the conversation along, and I was asked to talk about the big society, which was a thing in the Cameron government, the thing that we were we were all supposed to get on board with. The big society was something where there would be no poverty in this country because the warmth and kind-heartedness of the nation would furnish all that which the government sometimes is expected to do, but the Cameron government did not want to do, and in any case, who needs it, because absolute poverty does not exist. I spoke a moment ago about Peter Townsend. Peter Townsend, who was the co-founder of the Child Poverty Action Group, chaired it for 20 years. In 1965, he wrote a book with Brian Abel Smith. And in 1979, he crystallized his ideas towards the end of his working life with a book called Poverty in the UK. And it began like this, and when you hear me say this, you'll see the foundation of what that community organizer in your city said when they said there's relative poverty and absolute poverty. Poverty in the UK begins, and I'm quoting, "Poverty can be defined objectively and applied consistently only in terms of the concept of relative deprivation. That is the theme of this book." And Townsend went on from, at that time, his perch in Bristol University. He went on to found the University of Exeter, an eminent sociologist. But he brought to us the idea, firstly, that relative poverty produces not necessarily indigence, but produces a sense of powerlessness in the minds and hearts and lives of those who suffer it, and also leads, and he talked about a break point which leads to this point, also leads in a decoupling from the social life of the nation. That people in that state do not feel that they have a voice, they do not want to use the voice they do not feel they have. They decouple from social life, from what other writers are pleased to call social capital, which incidentally is an interesting phrase, isn't it? Social capital. They haven't got any social capital because they haven't got any money. They're not dying in the street of starvation. They can be ignored by the political right, but the fact is, nonetheless, that they are disengaged from the life of the nation. And Townsend developed that measure, relative deprivation. And if you go in this city, you'll find it, and in High Wycombe, you'll find it, in Hertfordshire, you'll find it, and in Liverpool, you find lots of it. Whole communities disengaging from the social fabric of the nation. And occasionally those communities have champions, working class champions who stand up and say, I want to make life better for my own community. Occasionally those people get elected to local office. Occasionally those people fight for it. And in Liverpool, that is the way that that city has been formed. But far more often, people disengage because they reach Townsend's break point. It is those people who can be reached by politicians who want to break the mold. It is those people in the United States who were reached by Donald Trump. It is those people in this nation who were reached by the last Prime Minister, but two. It is those people who can be touched by what is so often now called populism. They have disengaged, but they still want to hear stories. And the stories they want to hear are stories of success. So Peter Townsend is the first of my three popular sociologists. And the second, there are two of them, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who in 2010 wrote a book called The Spirit Level. The Spirit Level is subtitled, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. And they, building on Townsend, although they don't attribute this to Townsend, I'm quoting what they say, poverty is not a certain small amount of goods, nor is it just a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. It has grown as an invidious, this is Pickett and Wilkinson, it has grown as an invidious distinction between classes. And in that book, if you've bought the book, you know there are lots of graphs, and they explain clearly why the graphs are the way they are. But as an example, more people, they will demonstrate, suffer from mental illnesses in more unequal countries. If a country is unequal, more people in it are mentally unwell. And you can imagine where those people live. Life expectancy is related to inequality in rich countries. So although Lee Anderson and Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg may talk about the lack of an absolute poverty, if you go to Liverpool in the ward of Childwall, life expectancy is 12 years greater than in the neighbouring ward of Picton. Inequality kills people. More adults are obese in more unequal countries. The more unequal it is, the fatter people can be. I did a thing once for Christian Aid where I tried to live on £1 a day. Lee would have been proud of me. That's 3 meals. But all I could afford to buy, and I could live on £1 a day, all I could afford to buy was processed white bread, non-diet baked beans, the kind of thing that would make me put on weight. And in that week, I put on 2 pounds in weight. Not because I was living high on the hog or eating fish and chips or letting my children waste while I went and spent all my money on the national lottery, but because the only food I could afford made me unwell. More adults are obese in more unequal countries. Teenage birth rates are higher in more unequal countries. When you get those people who disengage because they feel themselves to be disempowered, these are the fruits of that disengagement. And they, Pickett and Wilkinson, quote someone from a long time before them. 1886, Frederick Douglass, a great fighter for the emancipation of slaves in the United States. Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced. This is 1886, 6 years after the Diocese of Liverpool was founded. Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. That's what Frederick Douglass said. If that's not prophecy, what is? People are disempowered. The poor you have always with you, because if you draw a line, there's always going to be someone below it. But in such a situation, those people will disengage. They will engage in behavior that hurts themselves. They will be open to the populist offer. And they will be very angry. I'm going to say in a moment why I believe the so-called Red Wall, which won the last general election for the Conservative Party, the Red Wall, which is predominantly in the Midlands and in the northwest of England, northeast of England, does not exist in the northwest of England. I'm going to try and tell you why that is in a moment. But for those people who live in those areas and who endure that disengagement, if you ask them, go out with a microphone and ask them in Vox Pop, what do you want to do with your life? Many of the young among them will tell you that they want to become celebrities. They want to become footballers. They want to do what they see rich working class people doing on the TV. And Pickett and Wilkinson quote a bumper sticker from the United States, which says, "The one who dies with the most toys wins." The one who dies with the most toys wins. Now, Pickett and Wilkinson also, because they're social scientists, they notice something in this society which in a sense runs contrary to that. And when I talk in a moment about David Goodhart, who's the third of my 3 popular sociologists, his work clearly echoes what Pickett and Wilkinson say, and I'm going to read it. because we believe the poor may be always with us. And I'm painting this rather gloomy picture of the disengaged poor in this nation. But it's also true, quote, caught up in day-to-day events, it's easy to forget that a longer view reveals an almost unstoppable historical trend towards greater equality. It runs, they say, like a river of human progress, from the first constitutional limitations on the divine right of kings, and continues on through the slow development of democracy and the establishment of the principle of equality before the law. Keep that phrase in your mind, because I'm going to quote David Shepherd later about that. Equality before the law. This river of equality swells, they say, with the abolition of slavery, strengthened by the extension of the franchise to include non-property owners and then women, picks up pace with the development of free education, health services, systems of minimum income maintenance, covering periods of unemployment and sickness. This was written in 2010, when there were more of those than there are now. It runs on, this river runs on to include legislation to protect the rights of employees and tenants, legislation to prevent racial discrimination, legislation with whatever exclusions for religious communities to protect the rights of the LGBT plus community. It includes the decline of forms of class deference. The abolition of capital corporal punishment is also part of it. In other words, they paint a picture where the poor you always have with you, and in unequal societies there is more hurt done to people. But there is also a river of greater equality in which we are all caught up, and for which and to which we can contribute if we want to see that society maintained. David was talking about the paradox, well-known paradox for Christians, that we're supposed to believe that the poor are blessed, and at the same time we're supposed to eradicate poverty. And you have heard people, mostly again from the United States and from the right wing there, who will say there is no need to eradicate poverty because poor people can be blessed, provided that they accept their lots. The rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate, Mrs. Alexander wrote. But that view is now seen as yesterday's view because of this river of equality that Pickett and Wilkinson talk about in 2010. And that brings me on to David Goodhart, who wrote 2 books, and again you may know them both. The Road to Somewhere in 2017, and a book called Head, Hand and Heart in 2021. The statistic I'm now going to read to you, I believe Dominic Cummings read it in 2017 and built a whole political movement around the numbers that it contains. Goodhart says there are 2 kinds of people. There are somewheres and anywheres. You may well know this. Somewheres are people who explicitly identify themselves with a particular location. They probably go and visit their mum there. When we did Mission Shaped Church, I think Jean and I were involved in, Mission Shaped Church found a statistic which is that half of Great Britain visits its mum once a week. Somewheres are people who can visit their mum once a week. Anywheres are people, by definition, who could live anywhere. So I was born in Yorkshire. I went to university in Birmingham. I went to theological college in Birmingham. And my ministry as a Christian minister began in Whitley Bay in the northeast. Went to London, Buckinghamshire, Hampshire, London, Liverpool. I am an anywhere. I could live anywhere. Now I live in Bath. All of those places where I have lived before, I loved living in. None of them has a call on me. I'm an anywhere. Here's what Dominic Cummings read. 50% of people are somewheres. 25 to 30% are anywheres. And the rest are in-betweeners. Of your 50% who are somewheres, 5 to 7% are hard authoritarians. These phrases are Goodhart's phrases. Of your 25 to 30% who are anywheres, 5% are global villagers. So if you're Dominic Cummings and you read that, you think, well, all we need to do is win the somewheres, and we've won the election. And he did. But Goodhart goes on to talk about what he calls the great liberalization, even in the context of a growing social conservatism. There is a great liberalization. Because Goodhart's images are easily grasped and quite intuitive, I have found them useful to share with people in a church context. My son's best friend was a little lad called Aid when we lived in Totton. I was the team rector of Totton for 10 years. Totton is a working class town on the edge of Southampton and on the edge of the New Forest. It's 5 miles away from Southampton, something like a 15-20 minute drive. My family used to drive in to go to the library in Southampton because it was bigger than the Totton Library, and while we were there we went for coffee in Del Marco's coffee shop. And Sam invited his friend Aid to come with us. We used to go every Tuesday. And Aid, when he was invited, looked terrified and said, I can't come because I've got to go and see my nan. Sam was an anywhere, and Aid was a somewhere. And when I read Goodhart's book, that came to me. It's also true that Sam was a member of the middle class. He was the clergy child. And Aid's dad was an engineer who worked with his hands. Poverty is located mostly among somewheres. Relative deprivation strikes at the somewheres. And there are more somewheres than anyone else. The most recent British Social Attitudes Survey, 2021, this is what they say, and I'm still on this theme of the great liberalization. On our survey, they say in 2011, 2/3 of respondents were classed as authoritarians. That's in Britain. 63%, while only 1 in 20 were liberals. Friends, if I went around here with a questionnaire, my hunch is that 60% of you would not be authoritarians. Because the self-qualification to get through that door puts you in a minority in this nation. And if I were to go around, which I'm not, and to ask what your income is, I doubt that many of you would fall into the definition of relative poverty which Townsend holds. So that was true in 2011. 5% were liberals and 2/3 were authoritarians. However, says the BSA, with just one exception in 2019, with one exception, can't imagine why, the proportion of authoritarians has fallen every year since. By 2018, it was down to 48%, while in our latest survey, 2021, it has dropped to a new low of 38%. Meanwhile, by 2018, the proportion who could be classed as liberal had increased to 14%, and it now stands at 21%. Britain has become markedly more liberal in its attitudes over the course of the last decade. What's the impact of that on poverty? The poor you have always with you. I don't know what the impact of that is. I do know that there is still a conservative majority, not politically, but in terms of social attitude. But it is a diminishing majority, and you may have seen in the newspapers in the last few weeks this statistic that says as people get older, they have always in the past become more conservative, but not now. My children's generation, my eldest daughter is 42, my children's generation are not becoming members of a property-owning democracy. They're holding on to the idealism of their youth because they have no alternative to hold on to. And that may change this nation going forward. But for now, the poor you have always with you, because loads of people are disengaged and there's a strong current, even though it's diminishing, of authoritarianism in this nation. And then finally on my sociologists, and then I'm on to other things. David Goodhart wrote a book called Head, Hand and Heart. It was a prophetic book. because it came around the time of the pandemic. Do you remember, you may have done it yourself, do you remember going out from your house to clap? Yeah. What we were doing by doing that was we were saying, there are people in this nation that we have never before honored, but we're going to honor them now. Goodhart says they were the workers who work with their heart. He talks about head workers. It's pretty obvious. He talks about people who work with their hands. That's pretty obvious. And then there are people who work with their heart. Care workers, nursing assistants, a fair few older generation nurses. These are the people we went out to clap because we wanted to honor their contribution to this society and the pandemic. But as you know, since, although we clapped them, we didn't pay them anymore. And that's because working with your heart is one of those things that can lead you to disengage because you work your socks off and nobody seems to care. The old Clause 4 of the old Labour Party, I don't stand here as a representative of the old Labour Party. You'll remember that Clause 4 said, we want to secure for the workers by hand and by brain. What they should have said was the workers by hand and by brain and by heart, the fruits of their labour. But, says Goodhart, we in this nation privilege the mind. So people will say about ex-Prime Minister Johnson, he was born to rule. He was born to it. He's got that self-confidence that comes with his education. And anyway, he knows loads of Greek and Latin. And so the mind is privileged in the minds of those who don't have that kind of education. And power is handed over. But at the same time, there's a regret in the eyes of the nation, especially the poor nation, about the professionalization of things. So when I was the team rector of High Wycombe, which was, as I said, a socially mixed town, you'd go to a working class home to find the body of the person who had died when you were doing a funeral visit, there in the front room, having been laid out by the woman in the street who does the laying out. If you're older or if you've been in ministry older, you will remember those women. The laying out, you didn't just ring the number and an undertaker came. You spoke to your neighbour who knew what to do with a body, and the woman came and laid it out. I come from Bradford, and there was a football disaster in Bradford. A stand in the football ground caught fire, and many people were killed. And a whole host of trained counsellors descended on the city. And a friend of my parents said to me, why are they sending all these people who know how to listen? Don't they think we know how to listen to each other? So the human skills of those who disengage are themselves being demeaned. I was a Samaritan when I was a student in Birmingham, and I went from Birmingham to Frankfurt, which is Birmingham's twin town. And in Frankfurt, the churches get 10% of the income tax. In other words, they're rolling in it. And so instead of Samaritans, what they had, the German word for it was Telefonseelsorge. It means telephone ministry, telephone care of souls. They had professional telephone counselors, paid for by the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches, so that if you were feeling suicidal, that's who you rang up. But when I was trained to be a Samaritan, I was told, we don't want your skills, we just want your humanity. And I think this business of the poor always being with us in this curious, complicated world where things are getting more liberal, but authoritarian people get elected, in that strange world, people honor humanity more, those who are at the bottom of these piles, than those who are at the top. And I'm going to quote two things now to move me on to God and theology, from David Goodhart at the end of his book, Hand, Head, Heart. Wisdom expresses itself often in counterpart to ideology. Ideology pushes us towards certainty, purity, and adversarialism. If you have ever listened to the conversations of the churches, this may echo things in your mind. Ideology pushes us towards certainty, purity, and adversarialism. Wisdom prizes humility, multiplicity, and compromise. And he leaves us, Goodhart, with an image, which is the image from Star Trek, where you get what he calls the most blazingly intelligent character, the Vulcan, Mr. Spock. You get McCoy, Dr. McCoy, the doctor, who sometimes seems not to know a thing about medicine, but he certainly knows a lot about the heart. And you get Captain Kirk, who's the guy who makes the minds up and gets on with stuff, and he says, none of the three alone is wise. Wisdom arises from the interaction between the three. Those of us who have made our living, and a comfortable one, out of the use of our heads, if we don't reconnect with the workers of the heart, not just clap them but learn from them, then poverty has not delivered for us the benefit that it could. And finally, this from Goodhart. He talks about, he's not a Christian, he talks about religion at the end of his book. He says, and this is debatable, but he says it, religion is born from the need to face death. And we secular people face death too, he says. Moreover, the still revolutionary idea of the moral equality of all people, regardless of talent or wealth, an idea bequeathed by Christianity, he says. This is the core inspiration behind the wish to rebalance human value away from the head towards the hand and the heart. Popular sociologists operating as prophets of wisdom in this society. I'm only going to very briefly speak about ABCD, and candidly, the only reason I'm doing it is because David put dependence in my title. There's various ways you can help people. You know this. Many of you do it day by day in your voluntary work or in your ministry. You can help them by treating them like clients, by robbing them of agency, by doing good to them. Or you can seek the asset that is in them. If you do the first, you get clientism, you get dependency. The first ever meeting of the mayors of the North, in the days when all the mayors of the North were Labour, they began by saying, we don't want to be dependent on London. We don't want to be dependent on London for handouts. We would prefer there to be a more equitable distribution of money for local government, because we want to stand with our heads high. We want to recognize the asset. So in Liverpool, 76% of all the churches, 76% of all the Church of England churches are actively involved in food bank provision. Providing a food bank is the easiest thing you can do for the hungry poor, and God knows we need it. But there was a guy who constantly used to stand up at meetings of the food bank providers and tell them all, us all, that we were getting the wrong end of the stick because we were giving people food and making them dependent. He wanted to give them all slow cookers and then vegetables so they could learn how to cook. He was right. And we tried to take on board his critique of the way in which we were doing Christian ministry, the way in which we were fostering and sustaining dependence. And we asked ourselves the classic questions from ABCD. How much do you need? How much do we need a steady stream of clients for our own survival as an organization or a project? Where are we creating dependencies by helping people, disconnecting them from the interdependence of their local community, giving them, if you like, a free undertaker, rather than finding the lady down the road who knows how to lay a body out? What are we doing that the community's networks could do for themselves? What are we doing to people that we could be doing with them? It's not rocket science, this, but in Liverpool, the churches tried to work to an ABCD model so that we could be there for the poor who really existed, but we could be there without fostering and creating the kind of dependency which does exist. How do we start from people's gifts and strengths rather than their needs and problems? And the classical case and place in the Bible for that, of course, is the feeding of the 5,000, where they couldn't have even got started had it not been for the little kid who was prepared to hand over their loaves and fishes. Celebrate abundance, multiply abundance. Cut the root of dependence. Honor people for what they can give, and you'll be doing asset-based community development. Be a guest, as they say, at other people's parties, rather than always inviting them to your own. Receive the gifts of those who work from the heart and the hand, and not only from those who work with the head. And finally on that, the thing that we used a lot in Liverpool, a book written in 1992 by Raymond Fung for the World Council of Churches. It's called the Isaiah Vision. And it quotes a bit of Isaiah that isn't normally quoted, and from Isaiah chapter 65. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. And so, Fung says, the vision is that children do not die, that old people live in dignity, that those who build houses live in them, and that those who plant vineyards eat the fruit. And Fung puts words in the mouths of Christians who are trying to help the poor. The God we believe in is one who protects children, looks after the elderly, and walks with working men and women. As Christians, we wish to act accordingly. We believe you share in the similar concerns. Let's join hands. That's Raymond Fung's approach. And we tried to work like that in Liverpool. Finally, before I finish, and we can have a break and a cup of coffee and then converse. Liverpool sees itself as facing away from England. Substantial numbers of Liverpudlians were born or have still relatives in Ireland. The largest church is the Roman Catholic Church. The second largest group of Christians is lapsed Catholics. The third largest group of Christians is Anglicans. There's an Irish connection and a Catholic connection, and there is a socialist connection. Until quite recently, the City Council, 90 seats, 81 Labour, 3 Liberal Democrat, 3 old-fashioned Liberals, and 2 Greens, I think. Not a single Conservative. In the diocese, 1 Conservative Member of Parliament. And if you're related to that person, I hope you're going to be finding them a job soon. Nonetheless, Liverpool, this is David Shepherd talking. Liverpool was built on the basis of the energy and enterprise of private merchants. Unskilled labourers came in very large numbers to live in extremely poor conditions in an erratic economy. During 150 years, many attempts have been made to pull together what was from the beginning a polarised society. He wrote that in Bias to the Poor. He was appointed Bishop of Liverpool in 1975, and he served until 1997. He worked together with Derek Warlock, the Archbishop of Liverpool. And sometimes I think the reason they found each other and were such good friends is that they were the only 2 upper middle class people in the city. But they got on really well. And Warlock, who was quite good at writing verse, spoof verse, wrote this to David, and someone made a sampler out of it, and I used to have it hanging in the wall in my home. In our Liverpool home, sent here from Lambeth and Rome, we're better together in protest and prayer. We've shouted for jobs in a voice loud and clear. When the city wants allies, we're proud to be here in our Liverpool home. And that was the way those 2 people and the teams they drew together around them approached their work. They shouted for jobs. It was employment that they thought was the most important thing to secure. They wanted to be allies. They were not lording it over people. But nonetheless, they saw themselves as having a voice which in government would be heard. And when Faith in the City came to be written, the model of Faith in the City was the model of a royal commission. We are speaking truth to the Thatcher government. And we know they will listen because we're speaking with all the authority of the Church of England. 1985. And of course it was accused of being a Marxist document. And the reason it was accused of being a Marxist document is that its theology was the theology of liberation. And it was pretty well unvarnished in the debt it owed to Karl Marx. Shepherd said, "Bias to the poor sounds like a statement of political preference. My experience has been that some of the most central teachings of Orthodox Christianity lead me to that position." That's what he thought, that's what I think, that's what many of us who take that approach believe, but that's not what we are heard to say by those normally in power in England. David saw himself as standing in, quote, the Anglican tradition of F.D. Morris, William Temple, and Michael Ramsey. And then he had this wonderful image. And I gave you a preview of this when I talked about equality rising in the nation. This is what David wrote. The great prophets of the Old Testament, like Isaiah, Amos, Micah, and Jeremiah, spoke about God's concern for righteousness or justice, tzedek in Hebrew. Tzedek topples over on behalf of those in direst need. This justice, and this is a bit of this book that I wish that my colleagues, sisters and brothers in the College and House of Bishops would hear more than they do. This justice is not the same as fairness, as though everyone started from the same line. It is not portrayed by the blind-eyed goddess of justice. We owe that picture of justice to the Greeks, said David. The blind goddess properly stands over the law courts. She does not look to see if the plaintiff or the defendant has the greater needs. She is blind. She dispenses even-handed justice. She assumes that she is settling a dispute between equals, but in the Bible, the righteous God is not blind. His eyes are wide open. That is the tradition in which I was brought up. It's the reason I jumped up and down when they gave me the chance to be the Bishop of Liverpool, and I wouldn't let John Sentamu finish saying the word. I want you to be the Bishop of he said. And I said, yes. My mentor in Episcopal ministry was Bishop Peter Selby, now retired. He used to be the Bishop of Worcester. He wrote a book called Liberating God, which is a wonderful book about exactly this. David Shepherd, in Bias to the Poor, wrote this quote, Fierro, that's a Latin American theologian, says that political theology is a theology operating under the sign of Marx, just as truly as scholasticism operated under the sign of Aristotle and the liberal Protestants operated under the sign of Kant. And he quoted, it shows how this is a modern man, he quoted from Gustavo Gutierrez, who is still alive, who was 95 years old last week. Liberation theology writers insist that the circle is entered by a prior commitment to the poor. Theology is a critical, reflective discipline. The first book is life. The second book is the Bible. Theology rises only at sundown. It was with that in mind that we wanted there to be asset-based community development. It's with that in mind that we rejoice at the gradual liberalization of this nation. But the poor we will have always with us. And the need to listen to the assets that they bring from their heart and their hand as well as from their head is that which compelled me in Liverpool to make the choices that I made. We went out on the streets, and I'm finishing with this, we went out on the streets of Liverpool and we asked people, vox pop on the streets, what do you think about Jesus? They didn't like Jesus. There was a time when they would say, we don't like the church, but we like Jesus. These kids, 25 to 40 years old, C2DE social groups. In other words, at the lower half of the social spectrum. We don't like Jesus. Why don't you like Jesus? Because we don't know about Jesus, but if he's anything like the churches, we don't want to know. We believe in God. We like God. Oh, and we like it when the churches get involved in helping the poor. We like it when they do food banks. We like it when they give us slow cookers. Oh, and we like it when they stay open so we can go in and be quiet. The gifts of the church to the working poor in Liverpool are justice and wonder. We like it when we have those two things. So we tried very hard to provide those two things. Daniel Berrigan, an American Jesuit, dead now. He was a protester for peace in the days of the Vietnam War. And he had a phrase. He said to Christians, know where you stand and stand there. Know where you stand and stand there. That image, together with the image of the God who sees, even when the goddess of justice is blind, that's the image which makes me reflect on the church in the way that I have. And I hope that I know I've gone over time, but I hope that I've not gone on for so long that there won't be time for us now to have a little break and then subsequently to have a conversation. But I'm not in charge of that, David is. Thank you very much.
And we will be thanking you for that later, Paul. Thank you. I have to tell you, Paul, that we are relatively poor because we have no coffee. I think that's relatively poor because there's probably some at home. So we're not absolutely poor. Yes, you've gone over time, but this doesn't matter. We will finish at 9. But I'm sure if you're anything like me, there were questions just popping up all the time during that tour de force. So if you have a question, and can we please make it questions so that the conversation can start, please put your hand up, and Louise is armed with a microphone and will descend upon you like the Holy Spirit. A question, please.
Is that it? Is that it? Yes, thank you. Well, thanks very much for that. It was marvelous to hear all those names, familiar names that you reminded us of. If I have a question, it is, do you really think that society is becoming more liberal? Actually, the real word I would use is more neoliberal these past 10 to 15 years, which is the opposite of liberal, like the gentleman sitting behind me, who is the co-author of the report on poverty. I just, if that's the question, one question, that's it. But a brief comment, if I may. We've had a lot of popular sociology, which is marvelous. But I think what we need today is a bit of popular economics. And because actually, social justice, the church likes to talk about social justice, but social justice, I think, is often rooted in economic justice. And that's why I mentioned neoliberalism. And what we now inhabit is a world which is determined and shaped by global financial capitalism. And actually, it is structured. The world now is structured, operating through the creation of indebtedness to create dependency. I'm afraid liberalism isn't going to help us deal with that. So I think popular sociology nowadays has its limits. We need some clear and popular economics to describe the current situation.
Thank you for the comment, which will stand as a comment on the question about the apparent growth in. I mean, the fact is, it is possible to become relatively popular if you fight the culture wars, if you find an oppressed group and demonize it. I mean, spectacularly at the moment, the trans community. If you say, you know, Keir Starmer doesn't even know if a woman's got a penis, that's a really easy way in which you can align yourself with an illiberal movement in society. But I think the sociology that I've read indicates that loud as that movement is, it is not very big. And I think it's possible if we I don't know how many of you here watch GB News. I would be surprised if any of you did, but you never know. You may watch GB News. If you do, you will find a small number of people who are trying to be noisy and succeeding. But whether Lee Anderson is right when he says, as he is quoted to have said, we're going to fight the next election on the culture wars and on knocking trans people. I think if you do that, then precisely your second point, you're going to miss out the fact that what most people want, in the words of Bill Clinton, is it's the economy is stupid. And I think that what we look to our political leaders for, I think, is a narrative which is inclusive of those who've disengaged, but a narrative also that honors and respects what those who disengaged have to give. At the moment, neoliberalism rules in the minds not only of the Conservative Party, in my judgment, but also of the present Shadow Chancellor, in the sense that we say we greatly and deeply honor those who work by hand and by heart, but we just don't have any money. Because various things are ruled out of court, such as, for example, the taxing of the rich. And I agree that when political parties stand up and say that, they don't get elected, as the Corbyn-led Labour government didn't get elected. And my own reading mostly is not of popular sociology, but as of the New Statesman, which I read every breakfast time. And the New Statesman spends every single episode knocking liberalism in every sense, and now talks about what they call the tragic society, the sense that we're getting a hell in a handcart. It's a nice rediscovery of original sin. But I'm afraid that I'm an unreconstructed socialist in the sense that I do believe that the greater equality in the nation will or should produce a greater economic equality. And I don't agree with those who, and there are many, and many of them have told me that that's rather a naive view. I'm afraid I'll just have to stand by that naivety. Thank you.
Louise. Thank you. Yes. Get close to the microphone. Yeah. Use it like a lollipop. Yeah.
Thank you. And of course, it is, you're right. And the statistic you used, those statistics about school children, I mean, that keys in, I believe, with what I said about the moment of disengagement. The really key thing, I think, that you said is that a lot of the people who receive benefits in this nation are working people. It's also true that a lot of the people who, for example, patronize food banks are working people. But the narrative is that benefit culture produces the indigent poor, that there are the worthy and the unworthy poor, the deserving and the undeserving poor, and that if you're on benefits, you must be undeserving. And I think, I mean, by definition, those who are working and on benefits, they know that that's not true. every day they go out to work to prove that it's not true, and yet their children disengage. And that, I mean, I think that's the heart of Townsend's idea of there being a break point. And I think that one of the many things that local churches can do is to give that honor to people, either if they are already Christian and they come and share in the life of the church, or if they come into connection with the church because the church is doing a warm Wednesday in the winter, or is giving them food bank provision, you know, as well as providing all of that, to provide the narrative that says, not you where you are loved and how wonderful that is, but what can we learn from you? What can you tell us? You know, why are your kids, why don't they have that aspiration? Teach us about why that is. And I think that sense of a learning church or of a learning society is one that I don't see much of, and that I wish I did. But it is, it's a simple answer to a simple question. Yes, it's a long haul, and it will take generations, but it could begin now.
Just a comment. I'm in favour of teachers. My daughter and my daughter-in-law are teachers, and a very good friend of mine teaches in a socially deprived area in a town not far from here. And she tells stories of the children who, come from dislocated families, from completely dysfunctional cultures, who don't have breakfast. And she sees her job as lighting imagination and doing all the things. Yeah, you can do the maths and the English and all the rest of it, but, and I was just going to say, I want teachers to be included in those who work with their heart. The good teachers are understated and underpaid, just like the nurses are. Sorry, end of commercial. Please. Oh, right at the back, yes, please.
I just wonder whether we're in danger of stereotyping the poor, and what you think, how far we extend fairness. For example, if affordable housing is one of your criteria, we now have people who would formerly be considered to be well off, who now cannot afford their mortgages. So should the rest of us be putting money into benefits for them?
Thank you. That's a great question. The government, I think today or yesterday, expressed its own answer to that question, which is no. I think it is, of course it's true that you know, my own kids are facing crippling mortgage rises. But at the moment, I wouldn't qualify I'm not saying we shouldn't help those who are caught in that particular trap. But I think that the disengagement that our friend here was talking about a moment ago in the schools, it's a long haul to get out of it, but it's also quite a long haul to get into it. And I think, you know, we've got a general election coming up. Goodness knows what the Labour Party will do, or will promise to do, about the mortgage problem. But I think the sense of social disengagement, which I've been talking about, takes longer to set in than the shock of seeing that your fixed-term mortgage is coming to an end and suddenly you're going to have to pay $2,500 a month more. I mean, that will produce profound anger, but it will also produce, I think, much more impact on our society, because the people who feel that way are well used to making that impact known. So it won't be I mean, one doesn't want to use words like lumpenproletariat, but you know, there are people in this country whose line about anything will be, it's not worth my even talking about this because no one has ever listened before. I think that one of the reasons that Conservative MPs, according to the headlines in the papers the last couple of days, Conservative MPs are trying to put pressure on the government to help with this mortgage stuff, is that those very people who are going to be deprived in that sense are by no means without a voice, and they will use their voice loudly, and I think that's entirely to the good.
You mentioned the provision of slow or air cookers to people who try and help their family need, and hoping that would impact on the food bank. May I ask what's happened with that provision of the air cookers? Has it reduced the need in Liverpool for food banks or not?
I really don't want to be dismissive of the trusts and charities which invest in food bank provision. And it would be great if both of those things could be done together. If you just leave it up to people, you just get endless tins of baked beans. I don't know what it's like in your food banks, but that tends to be the case. The far better, and the Trussell Trusts say this, a far better way of providing what people need is to give money rather than giving yet another tin of pineapple in sauce. So charitable provision doesn't always bite where it should. The guy who made such a nuisance of himself by constantly banging on about slow cookers was right in the sense that in a perfect world, those things would be, they don't cost that much, so those things would be provided to those who need them. And then what they'd get at the food bank would be a vast selection of decent vegetables and raw meat. But that's a holistic approach to provision. We used to say that the phrase, I used to co-chair a thing in Liverpool, the citywide strategy group for fairness and tackling poverty. And they produced statistical things. The city council officers produced statistical stuff about universal credit. There were two. There was the impact, the cumulative impact of various cuts, benefit cuts on individuals. So if disability was cut, and at the same time you had the bedroom tax, and at the same time the number of children that you had wasn't helped, then the cumulative impact was substantial. And there was the so-called, what we call the UCUC, the unintended consequences of universal credit. So there was a systematic understanding about what you could do. But what that runs into is the piecemeal approach to charity. That's not to say that the food banks are not doing any good. Far from it. Far better that you should eat baked beans than that you should starve. But I think ideally what we want is some joined up thinking around that. And a perfect world would be one in which this guy who kept banging on about slow cookers would listen a bit more to those whom he annoyed so much. Otherwise, you get the attitude, I'm not giving these people slow cookers because I don't like him, which is the besetting issue of the charitable sector across the ages, really.
Picking up my neighbour's point here about the economic dimension, I've been struggling over the last few years my way through Thomas Piketty's book on capital. And his suggestion, I think, boils down to we ought to be tackling extreme wealth, not just income, but wealth, and that just isn't happening. Can that not be part of the solution?
Thank you. Certainly can in my book. I mean, when I was talking earlier about Pickett and Wilkinson and the different inequalities, they wrote their book long before the present inequalities that produce billionaires. In the United States, democratic socialism means something different from what it means in England. Democratic socialists in America are more socialist than they are democratic. So people like Bernie Sanders is the kind of voice for that. But the sense in which you should tax the rich and the sense in which having even one billionaire is an offense against God is a bit Tuppence-coloured in its rhetoric, but absolutely right it seems to me, in its accusation that those levels of inequality are not acceptable. I don't know the numbers, and you'd be bored with them anyway. But the pay of CEOs in the United Kingdom as a multiple of the average pay of people working in those organisations has gone up stratospherically. And I used to be in the New Forest, and in some of those New Forest villages there are quite a lot of CEOs, And I know some of them were not driven by greed. The normal line is, we have to pay the going rate, otherwise we'll only get second-rate people. This is naive, no doubt, but I really do question that. And I know people who, of course, they want to live a comfortable life, and there is no problem with that. But that they should simply be, I find the very word, it's more of an American word than a British one. But normally what we say about the way you pay people, it's described as compensation. As though you're getting compensated for all the way that you waste your life in these horrid things. There are some people who love their jobs. And if you love your job, you shouldn't need to be compensated for that. And there, of course, there are models, all too few, but models such as the John Lewis Partnership, where it is possible to structure a going concern in such a way that you don't get those rampant inequalities. And I would be entirely in favor of such a world. And I know, because I've had it, it's all very well for you, Bishop, you don't have to earn your living in the marketplace. That's normally the way in which that approach is greeted. It's seen as being psychologically mistaken. Everybody's really driven by economics. They all really want as much as they can get. It's all compensation. If you think anything else, goodbye. And the evidence in that country is if people do sporadically come into the leadership of political parties who talk like that, nobody ever votes for them. Which may have something to do with newspapers and stuff, but I don't want to go there necessarily with only 10 minutes to go.
I take it you do know, Paul, that this is the only Labour stronghold in Kent in parliamentary terms. We love Rosie. Well, I think we do, sometimes.
So, what am I? What do I know? I'm just a fat cat.
Yes, a woolly liberal, yes. Anymore, sorry.
So the poor we are always going to have with us. And I wondered if I could ask you, what have you found to be the most effective ways of engaging the poor through church activity on a regular basis?
Thanks very much. What that touches on is what people need from the church and what they think about God. And I'm looking here at Jean, my sister, with whom I used to work on this kind of stuff. There are various ways you can approach that. My favourite churches in Liverpool were churches in places like Norris Green, which is a very profoundly deprived area, or Page Moss, which is the most deprived Methodist church in Europe. Because those churches were run by people from that local community who'd entered into their own strength and who weren't afraid of standing up to power, not least the wretched bishop when he wanted to change things. So for people to take ownership of their own local church is the kind of asset-based work that I was talking about. What that church looks like is entirely fluid. It could be that those people get together for a Book of Common Prayer in the Church of England tradition, a Book of Common Prayer service every Wednesday morning, followed by a cup of coffee, and that to all intents and purposes, it's just, culturally stuck in the 17th century. I don't mind about that at all. Or others may be much more like the kind of thing that when Jean and I were working together, we would try to encourage people to think about what we would then describe as new ways of being the church. The morphology is not important. What's important is that the ownership doesn't just rest with professionals. And I think I've got enough examples, and I know Jean runs one every week, of places where that can happen. When I was a theological student, my wife and I led a play scheme in Bermondsey in South London 3 years running. And there was a woman there, she was 22, she had 3 kids. First kid had come at 17. And her name was Cheryl. and she just ran the place. And all I needed to do as a kind of parachuted in professional youth worker, I just had to do what Cheryl said. And not because I wanted to avoid a row, but because Cheryl knew what she was talking about. And it is about liberating those voices. And in a world where those voices sometimes refuse to speak because they've disengaged, in Peter Townsend's words. So what it looks like, I don't mind, but what it needs to do is say to people, we're going to listen to you until you tell us. You know, when I was the team rector of Totton, which was a working class parish, we never had, I was there 10 years, we never had a vote in the PCC. We never voted, because voting was what middle class people did. And there were one or two people, professional people, who got involved in the church, God bless them, but they would say things like, you know, point of order, can we just move to a vote? And I would refuse to do it. And sometimes the PCCs would go until 11 o'clock at night. But eventually we'd all agree, a bit like the Quakers do. And I did that, hopefully, in the hope that if we waited there long enough, people would finally tell me what they thought. You know, that's the way I would see it.
Ever since the last meeting here, I've had in my head an illustration that was made by that speaker, which was about the Good Samaritan, that the church was very good at going to the rescue of people, but never got going on trying to make the road safer. And that seems to apply in this case as well, so that it's not only in local communities that people are enabled and empowered, but it's also the overall church thinking is much more about kind of doing good and running food banks and the homeless and all those things, and much less about what should we be saying, what should we be doing about the rich, or the, you know, and all the other things that we've been having tonight, like David Shepherd did, which I remember being inspired by at the time, but it's all kind of gone into the sand.
That's surreal. When I was on the citywide strategy group, I used to say poverty in Liverpool is and I used to use two words. I used to say it's a scandal and it's a tragedy, or I used to use it the other way around, tragedy and a scandal. It's a tragedy, and therefore, you know, people are wounded. Sometimes people say food bank provision, it's just a band-aid on people. But if people have been cut, they need a band-aid. So the provision, the pastoral provision of emergency things is necessary. But if that's all you do, then I don't want to demonize Sir Jacob, but the Rees-Mogg approach is, isn't it lovely that we live in a country where people will stick band-aids over the wounded poor? And it is lovely that we live in, I agree with him, it is lovely that we live in such a country, but it's also a scandal. You know, Desmond Tutu said, we fish people out of the river, but eventually we've got to go upriver and see who's pushing them in. And I think those two things together, the structural issues and the pastoral issues need to be held together. And I think in Bishop David Shepherd's time, they were held together that way. And he, I looked up something about Bishop David in preparation for this evening, and I think uniquely among retired bishops, a number of retired bishops are in their own right appointed to the House of Lords. And when I was in the Lords, I wasn't in there very long, but when I was in the Lords, you could see them. They were all sitting on the cross benches. But Bishop David sat on the Labour benches. He took a stand. He knew where he stood, and he stood there. And I think that is the pressure on church leaders to be even-handed is sometimes it's internal pressure. You know, I'm a bishop, I'm the symbol of unity, therefore I've got to be there for everyone. So if I offend someone one week, I must make sure to offend the other lot the other week. You know, that approach to episcopal leadership is what you might call the Greek approach. I'm going to put a blindfold on and be just. But if God is the God with open eyes, then occasionally you've got to take a stand. Normally what you're accused of then is not political partisanship. What you're accused of then is naivety. That's certainly been my experience. And that probably because I am myself more naive than most bishops who say this kind of stuff. But people will normally say, what do you know about anything grown up? You know, you who got your degree and then ever after you've received a stipend and you never had to work for it. That kind of attack is sometimes enough to shut people up, and sometimes enough to make them, because the next line of attack. So first of all, there's, you know, don't be so naive, and then if you keep on saying the same thing, after a while they'll say, well, at least he's prophetic, which means we don't need to listen to that. You know, so there are lots of ways in which political people can marginalize those who they disagree with. But I think you're quite right that to raise the question, and I give honor to the present, some of the present leaders in the Church of England. You know, I give honor to the present Archbishop of Canterbury for some of the things that he has said about structural inequality, and he has received, you know, the usual brickbats for it. But I agree with Michael Curry, Bishop Michael Curry, the presiding bishop in the United States, who preached at the royal wedding, you may remember. He said, you know, we want to include, this was on issues of inclusion in the church, we want to include everyone, not because we're in love with the spirit of the age, but because Jesus reached out his arms on the cross to include everyone. And that direct understanding of apolitical stance in the light of the gospel seems to me something that most of us as Christians would be able to do quite easily. 1 minute.
Oh, thank you ever so much for coming and taking us on a journey through some reflections on David Shepherd. For me, I started my ministry in the East End of London, where David set up the Mayflower Centre, and the work that he did, particularly in encouraging us to start thinking that God might have a bias somewhere along the line. And you've encouraged us to think again and go back to some of the theologians who maybe we've neglected in the past, and some of the sociologists that we've maybe neglected in the past, to the detriment of our church, but also I think to the detriment of wider society. And the words that you've spoken tonight, I think, have resonated with a lot of us here, and challenged us to think again about how we can be church, supporting those who are most vulnerable within our own communities. So thank you ever so much for all that you've had to say tonight. You go back to Bath with our love and our best wishes for all that you've offered to us tonight. So can we give a round of applause, please? I'm going to hand over now to Judith. Thank you very much, Judith.
Well, I'll come and stand up here, being the smallest of us all. Yes, I'm sorry to keep you a bit longer, because I'm sure you all want to get home and enjoy the last light of the longest day. But just got quite a few things to say. We've come to the end of our season this year, and it's been quite a season. We've had some wonderful talks, and we've ended on a most wonderful talk on a subject very dear to my heart. But we've also had our ups and downs. We have had speakers that couldn't come. We've had speakers that disappeared. And then we tried, I hope people are still listening in online, those that are doing that. We did try very hard last month to get the technology going so that our speaker last month could speak from his home in Birmingham and still be heard in Canterbury and the villages and the towns around us. And I'm sorry it didn't work. We did try very hard, especially Tim and Glenn, who is sitting there very quietly at the back, but I think he deserves a round of applause as well. But it did underline for us the fact that actually we do value most of all being a live meeting. And I think that the questions this evening prove that, and the fluidity and the companionship and the ease in which we can ask questions when we're all together and live is invaluable. And we do really want to continue with that. I'm stepping down as chair at this meeting. I've been chair for 6 or 7 years. And the very good news is that Doreen Rosman, who's somewhere here, is taking over from me. Doreen is more than capable and more than qualified. She's in fact probably the only remaining original person who really was in at the beginning of the setting up of this group. Oh, Mike Walling, who isn't here tonight, but yes. But Monica is, isn't she? Well, yes, do give a thumbs up to him. But Doreen has got that, and she's got the Methodist links, and we're so very grateful for using this church. And that brings me to another item that tonight we have to say goodbye and God bless and Godspeed to Tim, who is leaving after 5 years as minister of this church. He has been the most supportive member of our committee. He really truly believes in the values of this group. He's come up with ideas for speakers, and he's really been such a support to me personally, and that we do really wish you and the family all the best when you get to Leeds. I'm sorry to go on with this list, it's very nearly finished. We would, although we've got capable hands of Doreen, we would also like to invite anyone here who thinks that they could be cut out to being a member of our committee to contact us, contact Doreen, contact me, use the website to find out how to do that. And we would like to have another 1 or 2 people on our committee, particularly people who might be more comfortable with the modern world of technology, because I'm afraid most of us on the committee at the moment find it really rather overwhelming. But apart from that, is there anything anyone else on the committee thinks I've overlooked? I don't think so. But we do hope that Doreen.
Could I say, don't use the website to get in touch with us, because the email address on there is going to become defunct, and we haven't worked out how to replace it yet.
Okay, right, okay. Well, if you dropped a note to the church and put for the attention of Contemporary Theology Group, it could be passed on to us. Okay, so anyway, thank you all and have a wonderful summer. And we already have 2 speakers lined up for next year, so we're well on our way to providing you with a fascinating programme for 2024. Bye-bye.
Could I please thank Judith very much for all she's done in leading. And if you're not on our mailing list, there is a piece of paper on which you can put your email address, and then you'll get information about our next meetings.